people killed, including the soldiers, millions of people killed, a big percentage of their cities knocked down to the ground. I don't know how anybody even lives there. You know, when they say they took a poll and Zelensky's at 4%, who's living there? You know, I mean, people are, it's hard to believe that people live there. Their cities are being knocked down, and this is something that would have never happened. And by the way, for 4 years, it didn't happen. It was never going to happen. Go ahead.
Follow-up question. How Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky today accused President Trump of living in a Russian-made disinformation space. Yesterday, Trump accused Zelensky of starting the war with Russia. ABC's Karen Travers has the latest.
In Ukraine, rescue operations are underway in Odessa after a Russian drone strike today injured 4 people, including a child, and caused widespread power outages. Russia winning on the battlefield and the war of words. Ukrainian President Zelensky today accusing President Trump of living in what he calls a Russian-made disinformation space. Yesterday, Trump making a stunning and false accusation that Zelensky started the war with Russia.
You've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
That, in fact, is not correct. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russian troops marching over its eastern border on February 24th, 2022. Yesterday, American and Russian officials sitting face-to-face for the first time in almost 3 years, discussing how to end the war. But the talks did not include any Ukrainian or European officials at the table.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process.
Russian President Putin smiling today as he spoke about the results of those talks, saying President Trump is finally getting objective information. President Trump's envoy to Ukraine and Russia arrived today in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv as part of the effort to end the war.
Part of my mission is to sit and listen and say, okay, what are your concerns? Where are we at? So we can go back to the United States, talk to President Trump.
President Zelensky also blasted President Trump's claims that Zelensky only has a 4% approval rating among Ukrainians. Recent polls there show Zelensky with over 50% approval. Karen Travers, ABC News, the White House.
President Trump has said that he believes he has the power to end the war in Ukraine. He was speaking after talks were held today in Saudi Arabia, where Russian and American diplomats discussed ending Russia's 3-year campaign. More on those talks in a moment, but first let's go straight to Washington and to our North America editor, Sarah Smith. Sarah, what more did the president say?
Well, he said he thinks he's the only person in the world who can end this war, as well as saying that he has the power to end it, and also repeating that if he had been in the White House 3 years ago, this war would never have begun. Now, he's said that before, but he's always implied that that was because Vladimir Putin would not have dared to invade Ukraine if Donald Trump had been the president of the United States. But speaking a few minutes ago from his Florida residence in Mar-a-Lago, he seemed to be blaming Ukraine for not having made a deal with Russia prior to the invasion. He seemed to be saying that if he had been in office, then he would have forced a deal that anybody, he said, could have negotiated a better deal where they would have given up a little bit of land, not too much, and been able to avoid this war. Have a listen to what he had to say.
I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine.
I can't believe it. Can't believe it. Ukraine did not start the war. Ukraine was invaded by Russia.
that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
You should have never started the war. That's crazy.
Finally, homemade Manjaro makes your pants drop. In just 1 week, I've developed a 3-ingredient recipe that's 10 times more powerful than Ozempic and Manjaro combined. That's right. And before you think it's just another one of those crazy diets you see everywhere, know that even the biggest celebrities in the world like Kim Kardashian, Jessica Simpson, and
Now, of course, when saying out that Ukraine was complaining about not being invited, that was because they were not part of those talks that took place between America and Russia in Saudi Arabia today. Now, from the State Department, from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, we heard that those were not negotiations about how to end the war. They were simply initial talks between America and Russia, who will now put together top teams who will speak to each other about the parameters of how the war might end. And the Secretary of State was very clear. He said if they do get to the point of actually negotiating what a peace deal or a ceasefire might look like, at that point Ukraine will be brought into the talks and some European nations will be consulted. But for now, those talks are very much between only the United States and Russia.
Thank you very much, Sarah Smith there in Washington. Well, there were extraordinary scenes in Saudi Arabia where Russian and American diplomats on opposite sides for so many years held 4 hours of talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. One of those at the table, the Russian foreign minister, is even under US sanctions for the part he's played in the war. The two countries agreed to press ahead with negotiations. The talks are part of a flurry of diplomacy focused on Ukraine this week. Crucially, as you heard, neither Ukraine nor Europe were invited to the talks with US and Russian officials, which took place in Riyadh this morning. Instead, the US envoy Keith Kellogg is being dispatched to meet Ukrainian officials separately in Kiev. And while Russia and the US were talking, Ukraine's President Zelensky was in Turkey with President Erdogan. Yesterday, European leaders held an emergency summit in Paris to discuss Ukraine and European security, underlining the unease being felt about President Trump's plans to resolve the war. Our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is travelling with the American delegation and has been covering the meeting in Riyadh.
Face to face in a Saudi royal palace, a picture that makes history. Here was the US, the biggest single backer of Ukraine, sitting down with its friend's enemy, Russia. Both sides were silent and stony-faced for the media. But Vladimir Putin's team clearly happy that President Trump had ended their isolation and the world was about to be shown it.
We were brought in for a short amount of time at the very start of the meeting. So the doors opened. The press brought in and we saw that extraordinary scene. The first time any such face-to-face meeting has taken place at that level in 3 years.
Amid the surging anxiety in Europe over these talks, I shouted questions for Marco Rubio.
Is the US side Sidelining Ukraine, Mr. Secretary. What concessions will there be asked of Russia, Mr. Secretary?